This video is going to cover stress, trauma, and resilience. It's actually just the first part of what I'll be covering on these topics. We'll dive deeper into this when we meet in person. But I'm gonna give you some starting points of information about stress, the type of stress that's good for us, the type that's bad, ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. I will have you do a little bit of self-reflection. So if you have your notebook, please think about making a quick note, jot something down, or text yourself something if you are hopefully on the treadmill or out for a walk while you're listening. Definitely encourage you to do that. We'll cover stress symptoms, the effects of stress on our mind and body, and then we'll just start to begin talking about resilience. We'll cover a little bit about self-care, and then there will also be a related video about stress reduction strategies, and then how to have a positive relationship with stress. So let's start out with just a definition. What is stress? So stress is essentially a threat or a challenge. These are the things that that make up stress and that cause stress in us. So not all stress is toxic or traumatic, though. Of course, all trauma is stress, but not all stress is trauma. So just the adrenaline that causes us to want to get out of bed in the morning is a form of stress, and the challenges in the day that we meet that are not overly stressful are very healthy and good for us. A little bit of stress can actually boost our immune system, help you get over an illness you might be fighting off, but it's all about having it in the right doses. So in our brain, and we'll talk more about this in person, but our brain has a threat detection center. And when this part of the brain gets engaged, your amygdala, we get a fight, flight, or freeze response. This is your stress response system that engages. So fight is not necessarily throwing punches, but more so taking action and the ability to assertively make decisions, take action, maybe stop a threat or even move towards a threat. And flight is the desire to escape or leave, and freeze is kind of a shutdown response. One of the first things that our system does, very subconsciously a lot of the time, is we need to assess stressful events. You do it all the time in work, kind of you get hyper doses of it. And what is happening here is one of three things. You're either going to decide that whatever threat is going on is irrelevant to you. Maybe it's already being taken care of, or for some reason you know not to pay attention to it. Or the threat is benign, or maybe it's even a positive threat, such as something that's going to end up, helping the situation, or the threat is stressful. And so I think of this example where in the same scenario, two officers have very different reactions. So in this situation, a child was fatally wounded by mom's boyfriend, and one officer ended up tending to that child and found the event extremely stressful, of course. Another officer involved in the same scenario ends up apprehending the suspect and ended up feeling sort of strangely about how positively this event felt for him. So this threat ended up being a positive because he was able to take action and do something about it. There was a third person who witnessed this event but knew it was being handled and felt that the stress was irrelevant to them. So that's an example of how we appraise stressful events. And so we also then have to appraise our preparedness to deal with the event. So the officer who knows he can't save the boy's life may end up feeling helpless and potentially unprepared for the challenge in front of him. He's, not a surgeon or emergency room doctor with all the equipment and staff that would have been needed at that moment, had it even been possible to save the boy's life. This officer just had to deal with the awful situation as it was. The second officer, though, appraised the risk of harm when intervening, but he felt prepared and he was able to overcome the challenge. And so this same scenario ended up feeling very differently for the two officers. There are a few different categories of stressors. So not all stressors are the same, of course. And so there are 4 different categories. One is significant life changes. So if you've experienced the death of a loved one, loss of a job, divorce, childbirth, moving in together with a significant other, any of these major life changes or transitions are stressors. And so even if they ultimately seem positive, they actually are still a stress on our system. I think of my dog, Callie, who came to us in the last few weeks, had been living in another home, was back with the breeder for a couple of weeks, now with us. Ultimately, good things here are happening. However, just the transition is pretty stressful on her. So that is a significant life change. The second category is catastrophes. So things like war, natural disaster, like a hurricane or a tornado or a pandemic, these things are catastrophic stressors that cover really a large amount of people or land or the world. And they have their own type of stress. Daily hassles is the third one. So this would be all those things that sometimes feel like they happen in clumps. Getting a flat tire would be one of them. Maybe in the same day you drop your phone and the screen cracks so you can't use it anymore. And you get a call with some upsetting news or something like that. Feeling micromanaged is another one of these daily hassles. It's a stressor that sort of sits there that you are just pretty consistently having to deal with. Some other types of daily hassles can be anti-police bias or racism, having a very annoying roommate or other person that you live with, getting locked out of your house, if you accidentally step in dog poo, any of these things can be these daily hassles that actually most often for the average person are the most significant form of stress. So thankfully we are in a unique time period where we have a worldwide pandemic going on, which certainly is a level of stress to the humans in the world during this period of time, and has caused some significant life changes when people have died or there's been a job loss or people have had to move or ended up getting a divorce because of it or through it. And so you can imagine that lately a daily hassle may not be the most significant form of stress these days, but generally overall in human lives, they typically are on average. The last one here, the fourth one, is ambient stressors. So this would be the background noise of things like pollution, crowding, things that aren't urgent, but we may not even be consciously aware of them. And so, if we are always breathing in polluted air, we may not consciously notice it. Just like if you live near a farm, you may not notice the smell of manure after a while, but that doesn't mean it isn't still there. So even though you may adapt, it is still taking a toll on your system. It still has a role in your level of stress. So I would ask you to think about which categories does the stress of calls or cases fit in. It's an interesting question, right? Because I know that some of what happens, within the four walls of your agency may be the daily hassles or the ambient stressors. Same thing with what happens on the streets. But you could also argue that some of what the metro area has experienced in the last couple years has been pretty significant, and some of the calls that you're on are significant, life-changing, or even terrifying or horrific events to you, and also, of course, to those who you were trying to assist or protect in those moments. And then lately, you can layer on top the catastrophe of a worldwide pandemic. So a lot at play here regarding stress. If anybody is feeling more stressed than they did a couple years ago, I don't think anybody is gonna question why. This is a stress inventory you can take, and I would recommend, you can Google this. It's not going to be something that we look back at. We're going to do a different type of inventory or checklist when we meet in person, but this one is a really interesting one, and it will give you a sense of kind of the relative amount of stress you have in your life to your chance of having a health effect because of that stress. So if you fall in the 150 points or less range, you have a relatively low amount of stress and have a low likelihood of a health breakdown coming up here in the next couple of years. But if you're in the middle range, 150 to 300 points, you have a 50% chance of a health breakdown in the next 2 years, however that ends up looking for your system. And then 300 points or more is an 80% chance of a health breakdown in the next 2 years. So this is a statistical prediction model. If you're interested, you can go to stress.org / it's the HOMES stress inventory. So if you want to score that and then take the inventory, score it, and then kind of see where you fall. It really predicts your health based on life changes. And like I said earlier, it isn't necessarily whether they were good or bad. Of course, something like a divorce is going to be harder on your system than other things. But even what is a seemingly positive change or transition will still have an effect on you. The next thing we'll kind of set the stage about is our stress response. So homeostasis is when our body is essentially stable, so that the inner workings of our body are kept stable. You have homeostasis. This relates to your temperature, the pH balance in your body, all of these things. Are you hydrated? All of that. And so the opposite of homeostasis is a threat response. And this ends up looking like fight, flight, or freeze. And this is when the nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, which are broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems, this is when these will engage in a way that really allows you to return to homeostasis. So the fight, flight, or freeze response is meant to help your system return to that stability and balance that it is always seeking. So your endocrine system is involved in the threat response, and the endocrine system has to do with hormones. So chemical messages from your adrenal glands, like adrenaline, get sent into your body. Not exactly opposite, but in opposition in some ways to adrenal or to adrenaline is oxytocin. And this is a hormone that assists in bonding, and it can be a way to respond to stress in a healthy way. So it's otherwise known as the cuddle hormone, or if you tend and befriend is kind of the same related to oxytocin. So if you feel tended to, or like someone is being caring towards you or friendly, it can help calm your adrenaline response and calm your nervous system overall. So I just mentioned that because it is related to the endocrine system as well. just like adrenaline is, and all of that is a part of that threat response system. So I mentioned a little bit about the different types of stress. There's good stress, which is actually positive for our body. So brief increases in your heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels. This is actually good for you. We wouldn't get out of bed in the morning if we didn't have a little bit of stress. In fact, people with severe depression, part of the makeup that causes them to have trouble getting up and out of bed does have to do with adrenaline and those levels being off. There's also tolerable stress, which falls in the middle between positive and toxic. And tolerable stress is serious, but it's a temporary stress response. And we're really built for this. This type of stress can be buffered by supportive relationships. So another really good reason, of course, for a peer support team is to always have those around who understand how to truly be supportive and positive, and help buffer the negative effects. So this type of stress can be tolerable and even is some of what we're built for. Toxic stress is prolonged activation of stress. And so when the stress response system doesn't have enough protective factors, and especially protective relationships, you have however much sleep you have, maybe it's a sleep debt, or maybe you have a good amount of sleep happening for you, you have whatever exercise you've been getting, you're going to be primed and set up in a certain way regarding those things that you are personally responsible for. And then there's how much you've fostered supportive relationships, and also how much can be plugged in by your superiors, by your admin, by your peers, your friends, your family, and all of that. So it's really an important buffering piece, especially in the midst of a major stressor and during ongoing stress. So this type of stress that's toxic to us is that prolonged, chronically stressed out state. And this relates to this metaphor of a container. If you and your agency works with my practice, I'm sure you've heard about this. I use this metaphor all the time. It's just so simple and explains it so well. So often when you experience something or feel something, it will just sort of pass through this container. And really our body is this container for emotion. So feelings are meant to be temporary, feelings are meant to be felt, and they're meant to pass through if they are acknowledged and processed, they move through you. If they aren't, and say you're sleep deprived, you're not exercising anymore, you don't feel supported, you're just trying to kind of pack away tough things because you think that might be the best way to deal with it, or that's what you have to do all day at work, but you never take those things out and examine them and tidy them up and know what's happening for you in the background, this container can start to fill up. And so what tends to be in here are those experiences that were overwhelming to your system, or where your threat detection system had to switch on. The experiences that could have started all the way back in childhood, some major, some minor, but they were impactful for some reason. And all of the things that happen in your personal and professional lives. So the more you have in this container, the less room there is for more stress. So I can't emphasize enough, it's so important to keep this level down as low as you can, so that you've got the capacity you need going forward. You know that there will always be more stress ahead, and it's important to have the capacity for it. I see a big difference in those who have managed their stress well and leaned on others and gotten help when needed. In these areas, they're so much more resilient when more stress comes along versus quickly running out of room and your system getting overwhelmed. So I would give you just a minute here to think for yourself about what's in your container. How full is it? Is it just a little bit at the bottom? Is it halfway full? Is it nearing the top? Is it overflowing? And hopefully it's not overflowing or even nearing the top, but I do want you to know where it is and actually think for yourself. Maybe in your notebook, jot down even a picture of a container when you get back to your notebook. Hopefully you're taking a walk or doing something that involves movement right now. But you might even make a list for yourself of what's in there. What have you experienced that sticks with you, still affects you, has maybe shaped who you are or how you operate or how you feel? And some of those things never fully disappear, but they certainly can be processed and minimized as much as possible. So they may have to do with personal life, work life, or whatnot. If you don't know for sure now, or it's something that you end up adding to over time, please do that as we near our 2-day in-person portion of this training, because we'll be using that when we meet. I also want you to think about how can you tell how full your container is. And we're going to talk about the effects of stress on a person and how that can start to show up and look and how it affects their body. So when you're thinking through what may be in your container, and I ask you to think about this for yourself first, because we're not really any good to anybody else, at least not for very long, if we aren't taking care of ourselves. So I always say part of what I do outside of work is try not to be a hypocrite. So I've got 2 teenage kids, and now I have 3 dogs and my business, and I have plenty on my plate, and I really have to prioritize taking care of myself in all of the ways that I talk about to everybody who I get to work with, so that I am still useful to those I'm trying to help. So it's the same exact parallel process for you as a peer support member. So a lot of what I'll do and ask you to do and really challenge you to do is to look at yourself really honestly. I don't think it's very fair to ask others to do something they haven't done before, or self-reflect or be accountable to their own stuff if you or I or we haven't done that ourselves already. And really it's a continual practice of doing that. So we'll get started on that right here, right now, if you haven't already made this a practice for yourself. If you have, fantastic, let's build on that. So what's in your container? These could include all kinds of things, starting with childhood experiences, major losses, such as the death of a loved one. Divorce is another major loss. Chronic illness is certainly something that is sometimes in there, or traumatic injuries, car crashes, work exposures to trauma, of course. Whatever those snapshots are that you have saved, they're saved because they are tied to a stress response. Your brain tags them as important and related to safety and survival. So those may be sitting there still. If you have special needs children, if you are caregiving for aging parents, if you have any depression or anxiety symptoms, especially if you brought those to the career with you, those are often also can be signs of a stress response, but sometimes they are standalone themselves. And then alcoholism is another one. So we'll have an entire section on alcoholism, and you'll have a really good sense about how to look at it and understand it and see for yourself where you stand with alcohol, which can then help you help others, of course, with wherever they may be with the use of it. But it can, of course, take up a portion of that container, and sometimes it's primary, and other times it's being used as kind of a unhealthy coping mechanism. And other times it's used in a very mild or moderate way and not to an unhealthy extent. So some of the work exposures to trauma I have outlined here, and I will also just cover them briefly. Um, if you end up going back to this section, we're at about 25, 26 minutes into this video. If you want to come back to this, it may kind of cue you to remember different scenarios that have stood out to you for whatever reason. So I've had a number of officers say it's kind of good to just see this list because it reminds you of really all that you do see. So suicides, including the way that the person or body looked, and any other sensory input related to those. Same thing with homicides. So the longer you had to be on those scenes, the more details you saw, the more you heard of the story, the more family members you had to speak with, the more senses that you had involved, the more likely it is that that will have a lasting effect for you. Car accidents is another one, especially if there are people who are suffering or bleeding or dying. And then sometimes if fire is involved, there's a certain smell or feeling to that. Death notifications, having to bring terrible news to someone and hand that off to someone who otherwise had no clue that bad news was coming, or maybe it's their worst fear, is another one. Child abuse and death, criminal sex cases, and then involvement in any kind of shooting, whether you were the shooter or you were shot at or a partner was shot at, or any of those things. And then severe and persistent mental illness in the community. If you work in corrections within the prison population, jailers have to manage those things day in and day out in their jobs. And a lot of times you have the frequent flyers who, knowing about their scenarios and sometimes suffering and trying to help and sometimes losing them. There's so many dynamics involved with the severe and persistent mental illness piece that I've included it as a potential trauma exposure at work. Witnessing autopsies is another one for some people. And some of these will be meaningful to you in a negative way and others won't be, and vice versa to the next person. So trauma is not specific to an event, it's specific to an individual. So what is traumatic for one person is not necessarily for another. I use the word trauma and traumatic, and I will explain it much more when we are speaking in person, but it's essentially has to do with that on switch for the threat detection system when there's something that's terrifying or horrific or just even safety and survival is involved. That can be what cues the brain to have a chemical response that causes it, the memory to save differently, and that's essentially what I'm talking about as far as trauma. So generally here, these are other pieces that can add to how full your container is. So generally there's increased safety concerns for officers lately, less compliance, more cops are being killed by ambush type and suspects attacking them. There's an increased reluctance to use force, increased scrutiny, there's increased tension between police and people of color, increased reluctance to stop and question suspicious people, And then there's sometimes communities that are giving you the message that just doing your job is the problem. And then there's changes in laws and expectations and responses that's happening. So a lot going on there. Again, just transitions can be very stressful on our systems, and you are certainly in the midst of one. So it's understandable if levels of stress are really much higher lately. So what else could be in that container? This is where I want to talk about ACEs. So ACEs is a acronym, and it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So how do ACEs relate to toxic stress? So these experiences happen as the brain is still developing, which technically takes about 25 to 30 years, depends on the person. It's a little earlier for females, like closer to 25, 26, and a couple years later for males. But especially in the childhood, teenage, and young adult years, if anybody experiences things like physical and emotional abuse, neglect, caregiver mental illness, or household violence, these things increase the amount of what you carry in that container. And they also increase the chance that you will suffer from things like heart disease, diabetes, and substance abuse. So what happens is any of these stressors, toxic stressors that are either severe and acute or chronic, can excessively activate your stress response system. And so you get long lasting wear and tear in your body starting from a young age. You're also then developing, your brain is developing around these experiences. So it's sort of like if your engine is revving for days and weeks at a time, it's going to be really hard on it. It's going to wear out the car, right? So this is what ACEs can do to a person. You can reduce the effects of ACEs and toxic stress. Of course, mental health care can help. Meditation, physical exercise, time in nature, support from others. But best case, these things get prevented. So if any of you have kids, I'm sure you're well aware of wanting to protect them from all of the things you see at work. You routinely, I'm sure, work with families where adverse childhood experiences are happening, and you can, I'm sure, see in the kids the ways that they're suffering. But having strong, responsive relationships between kids and caregivers really helps build up the skills and can buffer kids from the effects of this type of chronic stress. The way that we know about ACEs is there was a study done over years and years, and they studied kids and what is it that causes kids to have different outcomes and what is it that causes stress. And they boiled it down to about 10 or so things. That's not an all-inclusive list, but we will look at this a little more too when we meet in person. So I want to talk here just briefly about storytelling. And the reason is because storytelling can be very healing, and it can also really be the thing that leads to a person feeling understood. But you do have to be able to tell your story. So I'm going to have you practice this when we are in person. I'll be asking you to really practice being a peer and getting and giving support as you'll be doing. I think the best teachers are also eternal students. So we will have the chance to be in both positions when we meet in person. But I think one of the things we're trying to undo is this, sort of unspoken rule that we don't talk about feelings, that in the police and first responder world, you're weak if you have feelings, you're weak if something affected you. And I think it's led to police especially being misunderstood. And I think a lot of times there's a protection aspect of this, which is a positive. You don't really want to be the one who causes your loved one or your community to lose their kind of naive situation, not from not having to see or know or do what you do in your work. But at the same time, there are consequences to not telling those stories. So part of the reason sometimes people stay silent is you're trying to protect others. It can feel safer to stay silent. Over time, it isn't safer for an individual. It can aid in that stacking effect of the stressors that can happen. But sometimes people don't know how to tell a story because first you may think, why do I have the right to communicate my suffering when I see others suffering much more. They live these things that you've maybe been a part of in a relatively momentary way. But that also keeps somebody from being able to explain what they've seen or done and how they felt about it. So it's all relative. This can create a divide. It can also be a problem between peer-to-peer type scenarios when if a peer doesn't know how to just purely listen and to listen for emotion and feeling and try to understand and validate, if it becomes kind of an opportunity to one up or that sort of thing, or who has the bigger fish story kind of thing, and it gets exaggerated each time you tell it, it can really, you can lose the opportunity. So what I'd like to do is have you, the reason I wanted you to kind of describe and start to list out and flesh out what's in that container for you individually, is I want you to start practicing telling what you've experienced and then receiving, you know, the listening ear and the support and the validation and the understanding and even guidance from your peers who will be practicing with you when we meet in person. So start to think about what's in there. We, of course, will learn the most from actually practicing these skills. And I'll, of course, give you quite a bit more guidance before we start practicing. These are some of the stress symptoms that exist. I won't name every single one of these. And if you're listening and not watching as well, don't worry, because you'll get a handout with all of these when we meet in person, and you'll be able to review them there. So these stress symptoms fall into 3 categories. There's the physical, the thinking symptoms, and the emotional. And the formatting didn't translate correctly on this page, so actually some of them are cut off. So we really don't need to worry about it here. But essentially, some people, and very commonly in law enforcement, just like in the military when I worked, and I still do work with plenty of vets, often stress shows up very physically. So I've had countless clients say, I got checked out by my MD, and what's happening with me is stress. I'm having X, Y, and Z going on. Maybe it's chest pain, maybe it's sleep disturbances, maybe it's tension headaches, or a sick to your stomach, gut punched kind of feeling. It could be diarrhea with no other explanation other than some excessive worry or anxiety. The next category is thinking. So stress symptoms that fall in this category would be things like slowed thinking, difficulty problem solving, having kind of brain fog or memory problems. If you are seeing images in your mind of awful stuff you've had to see or do, that would be another one. Having a short attention span, things like that. And then emotional, obviously stress symptoms can show up emotionally. You could feel panic, fear, guilt. You could feel depression or even numbness, which is a lack of feeling. You could feel excessively worried about others. You could want to isolate and be by yourself, or you could feel anger or irritability, among many others. I mentioned earlier that sometimes law enforcement will notice signs of depression and anxiety, and unless you came to the profession with depression or anxiety symptoms, it's very possible that they are actually symptoms of a stress response. They're just the most recognizable stress symptoms, so they are really commonly what people are coming in noticing, even though they aren't usually the only symptom happening. So there is certainly overlap between depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress and the symptoms of all 3 of those. So that's how that can end up happening pretty easily. So these are symptoms of depression: depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, diminished pleasure in things that you used to enjoy, significant weight loss or a decrease or increase in appetite, a slowing down of thought and reduction of physical movement, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or feeling inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness, and recurrent thoughts of death or suicide or a suicide attempt or a plan. So these pieces for most days for more than 2 weeks is a sign that depression is very likely happening. Some of these things are often happening as a part of a post-traumatic stress response. They may happen temporarily in the acute phase following a stressful incident and then fade away, or they may be an ongoing thing if your post-traumatic stress is high and has stayed high for a while. On the anxiety side, the most important symptoms to be aware of here is excessive worry about events or activities and difficulty controlling that worry. And then the anxiety and worry is associated with 3 or more of these things. So getting tired very easily, feeling restless, keyed up or on edge, difficulty concentrating or your mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbances. And then the anxiety, worry, or physical symptoms cause significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So that functioning piece is an important one. I always say if you're not feeling or functioning the way you want to, there may be a stress or mental health related piece to it. Here, I want to just mention kind of a side note. It's important to cover the difference between burnout and stress. So burnout is not the same as stress or trauma or PTSD. Burnout is a state of exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and loss of personal identity. Burnout is not like some sort of technical clinical term or medical diagnosis. There can be depression behind burnout, can be a piece of it, but not necessarily. There can be some things that lead up to burnout, including feeling like you have to prove yourself and working really hard or too hard to try to do so, neglecting your needs, and then thinking. So displacement of conflict means that you may not realize the actual core of the problem in front of you. And if you are spinning your wheels trying to work hard and kind of swim upstream and you're not even actually addressing the problem that's the core of the issue, you may end up experiencing burnout. Becoming intolerant, aggressive, or sarcastic can be part of burnout. Isolation and alcohol overuse and feeling empty or significant behavioral changes or depression can also be part of burnout. Sometimes the work environment can be a cause for burnout or part of the cause. And these are the pieces that make up that work environment: excessive workloads, lack of flexibility in schedule, lack of worker autonomy, so not enough control essentially over your situation. Otherwise, this could be also another area of lack of worker autonomy could be if you feel micromanaged. Destructive competition among coworkers is another work environment factor related to burnout. Getting shut out of opportunities, loss of a shared common meaning and purpose at work, workers feeling they're not meaningful change agents, fear as the primary experience of work, self-sacrifice promoted as the model of work and efficiencies in the workplace. And it's potentially possible too that there could be a work environment where burnout is really just sort of the norm. And so these understandably are, happening in some places I may have heard of. And so this might explain what's happened for some people, which is different than post-traumatic stress. It isn't that they can't both happen, but post-traumatic stress is separate. All right, so let's talk about the effects of stress on the body. So musculoskeletal system gets affected by stress, of course. As I said, we hold stress in our body as muscle tension. When we are stressed, we tense our muscles in a protective response to try to guard ourselves against injury and pain, and also to potentially ready ourselves to take action if we need to. So chronic stress can cause the muscles in the body to be essentially in a constant state of guardedness. It can be really difficult to relax. Sometimes a way to encourage emotional and mental relaxation is to physically relax, whether that's sitting in a hot bath or shower or hot tub or getting a massage, stretching, doing yoga. Any of those things will physically relax your muscles, which also directly translates to how relaxed you mentally feel. Your respiratory system is affected by stress. Your respiratory system, of course, supplies oxygen to cells, and it removes carbon dioxide waste from the body. So when you have stress and strong emotions, you can have shortness of breath and rapid breathing. So the stress response system actually causes shortness of breath and rapid breathing, shorter, more shallow breaths. And there's a good reason for that. Your system is preparing to be able to fight, flight, or freeze, and hopefully fight. Definitely, if you're in law enforcement, you need to be able to take action and be assertive and even move towards danger, like we said. But you might notice that this type of breath can last and be chronic even when it isn't necessary. And so that's why breath work can help you regulate your nervous system, because you're now taking control back of that otherwise automatic system. So we'll talk more about that later. Your cardiovascular system is affected by stress. The heart and blood vessels are the two main elements working together to provide nourishment and oxygen to the organs of the body. These two elements are also coordinated with the body's response to stress. So your cardiovascular system will prepare itself for fight, flight, freeze if you are stressed. And like I said earlier, we are built for some temporary stressors, but not for chronic stress. Chronic stress is what will cause you heart disease because it'll wear down your system. Your endocrine system, we talked about this. When your adrenaline gets released, and because you are detecting threats. Your gastrointestinal system gets affected. The gut has hundreds of neurons, and they're constantly communicating with the brain. So this is why you can feel that butterflies in your stomach thing, because of something that you think of or see. And so when you are under stress, your digestive system shuts down. Your body thinks, hey, we're not going to be digesting food now. For some people, when they get stressed, they have the urge to use the bathroom because their system is overwhelmed by the stress and having that kind of reflexive response. That's a little more rare, but more often people's digestive system gets shut down. On the other hand, some people respond to chronic stress with an overactive appetite and overeating. And often that is a way to try to calm the system, because usually eating food is a way to slow down to down regulate, blood rushes to your stomach. You feel calmer often after eating. Nervous system. This of course is, the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves. Those all make up the nervous system and are included in that fight, flight, or freeze response. The male reproductive system is included here as far as stress effects on the body. There is testosterone produced when we are in fight or flight mode, and this creates a type of arousal that allows for that fight mode. And then cortisol gets released, of course. And cortisol can affect the male reproductive system negatively, of course. It can also affect the female reproductive system. So there can be absent or irregular menstrual cycles when somebody is under a lot of stress chronically. Periods can be more painful, and there can be changes in length of cycles. And then stress will also affect sexual desire, pregnancy, PMS, and menopause. We're going to talk through PTSD here. I'm giving you really just kind of the, textbook, like background foundational information on these aspects of stress, because I want you to really understand it inside and out. And so for any of you, if this is a repeat, I apologize. I hope it's a good refresher. And for any of you that this is new information, please take note and make sure that you have these things really stored away, because of course the reason we're here in a peer support training is because your jobs are stressful. So stress really is all the foundational information that you'll need to know about. So PTSD, also known as a stress injury, it really is an injury to the brain, not a mental illness, hardly a disorder. It's a condition, but it's actually an injury. So just like any part of the body can be strained or fractured, so can the brain. And so too much stress over too much time, it's usually the accumulation of it versus an acute event for officers that causes it to start to stack up. PTSD is a mental health condition. It gets triggered by a terrifying event. It can cause flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety. It can happen from one single event or from ongoing trauma. There are a few areas of symptoms that folks will experience, and I'm going to run through what those are. I'm also going to run through the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, just so that you have some familiarity with it. So, to be diagnosed with PTSD, someone must have this combination of symptoms for at least 1 month. So prior to that 1 month mark, it's very common after an acute event for someone to have acute stress disorder. Acute stress disorder is a temporary diagnosis, and at the 30-day mark, if someone is still having those symptoms, it then essentially evolves into PTSD. PTSD happens on a spectrum. Once somebody meets criteria for a diagnosis, they can have mild, moderate, or severe, and you can move along that spectrum depending on how triggered you are, how much healing and therapy and trauma treatment you've done, and how well you're taking care of yourself, and all of those kinds of things. So at least what needs to be included is at least one re-experiencing symptom, and I'll explain what those are. At least one avoidance symptom, and I'll explain those. At least 2 arousal and reactivity symptoms, and then at least 2 cognition and mood symptoms. So these are the re-experiencing symptoms, and remember there needs to be one of these. So flashbacks, reliving the traumatic event, including physical symptoms such as a racing heart or sweating, recurring memories or dreams that are related to the event, They're not often the actual replay of the event, but something similar that brings up the same feeling is most common. Distressing thoughts or physical signs of stress. And then there are different thoughts or feelings that can trigger these symptoms, like words, objects, or situations that remind your nervous system of the event. There needs to be at least one avoidance symptom, so staying away from places, events, or objects that are reminders of the experience, avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the traumatic event. And these avoidance symptoms need to cause somebody to change their routines. For example, if you were in a terrible car accident, you may choose not to drive or ride in a car afterwards. That would be an avoidance symptom. There needs to be at least 2 arousal and reactivity symptoms. So this includes things like being easily startled, feeling tense, on guard, or on edge, having difficulty concentrating, having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, feeling irritable and having angry or aggressive outbursts, and engaging in risky, reckless, or destructive behavior. So these are pretty common, even if somebody doesn't meet criteria. And these interfere with parts of daily life, like sleeping, eating, or concentrating. Cognition and mood, there needs to be at least 2 of these symptoms. So you may have trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event. You may have negative thoughts about yourself or the world. You may have distorted thoughts about the event that cause feelings of blame, like maybe I could have done X, Y, or Z. You may have emotions related to that include fear, anger, guilt, or shame. It's actually a sign of helplessness to feel guilt as if there's something you could have done when truly you were just helpless. Loss of interest in previous activities, which can overlap with those depression symptoms. Feelings of social isolation, and then difficulty feeling positive emotions such as happiness or satisfaction. So those are all of the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. And next, I want to talk a little bit about resilience. So like I said, when we meet in person, we will return to the topic of stress and trauma and resilience, but I wanted to give you all that just very foundational information on stress and trauma. We'll go into it in a deeper, elaborate a little more in an engaging way when we meet in person, and then we'll talk more about resilience and the different factors that make up resilience. But I want to begin with just the definition. So resilience is the ability to recover quickly from difficulties or bounce back. So I break it down into 6 categories. If your agency works with us, you know this. We've probably reviewed these with you. It's what we like to make sure you're on top of, all of the pieces of it that you can be that are really up to you. And there is no, one single thing that creates resilience. It's really this multifaceted approach. So it's that combination of the many factors that allows for resilience. Resilience in children, because lots of people have been through plenty as a kid and made it through and did well even. And so sometimes there's an inherent resilience that's actually genetic and built in. And sometimes there is or isn't, but there are certain factors that predispose somebody to have positive outcomes despite the adversity that they felt. So what you can think about, you may be thinking back on yourself or someone you know who went through quite a bit in childhood, or just even not a lot, but something notable in childhood. You or that person may still be very resilient. And so the counterbalancing factors to that adversity are here. There's 4 of them. So facilitating supportive adult-child relationships is one. Building a sense of self-efficacy and perceived control is another. providing opportunities to strengthen adaptive skills and regulatory capacities is the third one. And then mobilizing sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. So these are the 4 things that it can essentially stack the scale to outweigh adversity in children. And I listed them here too because they also matter for adults. They continue on and they do apply here in relation to the 6 resilience factors that I focus on. So the 6 factors are listed here. The first one, the most important one, is sleep and deep rest. You don't have to be asleep to get deep rest for your brain, but you do need sleep and deep rest. This helps counteract the intensity of your work, especially if you can build in some rest within your workday. And then sleep is the most important way that your brain repairs. We'll talk much more about sleep in depth when we meet in person. Exercise, nutrition, and hydration is next. Movement is just a really close second to sleep as far as what's most important regarding your resilience and your stress management. And we'll talk more about that too. Support at work and connectedness at home is the third piece here. So feeling supported at work, like they've got your back, you as a peer support team member make up part of this really integral piece. And connectedness at home is important too. So you'll have a video section on law enforcement families, couples especially, and you'll learn more about that unique piece. Living a balanced life is the next one. So what do you do with your free time? What do you do for fun? What do you do to take care of yourself? Who do you connect with when you're away from work? And then the next piece is mindset and attitude. We'll talk about that a little more, go into more detail on what that is, and then professional care. So the access to it, to someone who knows what they're doing and how to help someone who's occupationally competent, but also, and just as important, is your willingness to access it. So I always say, be willing to do yourself what you're going to ask others to do. You will inevitably run into a peer who really does need professional care, and it's best if you have received it yourself. You know, by the time we're, I don't know, pick an age, 28, 25, 30, whatever it is, there's baggage, there are things to hone in on. A therapist can be used for coaching purposes regarding your resilience factors or relationships or stress levels, all different kinds of things you could use it for. And to have given that a try yourself will be a big piece of credibility for you as a peer support member. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to do that. So essentially what we're trying to do, of course, with the resilience factors is offset the stressors of work in public safety. So the opposite of disease is ease. And we're trying to avoid heart disease, right? Mental health conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder. And we want to stack the deck on the side of ease. And so these are all the pieces that bring ease and help offset that. So there's 2 ways that these 6 factors are possible. One is through agency programming. We listed and talked through a lot of the components of a comprehensive wellness program and what an agency can do to really present these things and more as readily available to you as possible. But ultimately, it takes individual initiative. So that's what I will be asking for from you, is to really think about which of these pieces, and especially as you get to know a lot more about the details of each of these, which ones do you already know, or maybe areas you need to work on. We all have them. None of us are perfect at all of these 100% of the time. It's not possible. But which ones do you need to work on, and what would you like to do to start doing that? We are all a work in progress. It's all just about progress, not perfection. And so I'd like you to think about which one of these do you want to even just start making some small changes between even now and the time that we'll meet in person, so that you can be doing your own work kind of in parallel to others who you will be supporting, and then everyone else who is taking this course along with you. I want to talk about mindset here. We will cover more of the other pieces of resilience in later videos and when we meet in person. But I wanted to start with mindset, not because it's the most important. Sleep is actually the most important. But I wanted to start with mindset because it really is something that you have control of. You can think about for yourself and really tune it to where you want it to be as you move forward in this training. So mindset is essentially mental hardiness. And what is it that causes someone to be able to flourish and even thrive amidst and despite adversity and stress and the challenges of a high performance job like you have. So one of the first pieces of mindset or mental hardiness is challenge. So someone who is mentally hardy views challenges as inherently meaningful and as opportunities for growth. So personal growth and development is what you see when you meet a challenge. You think to yourself, not, I am a victim to this, but this is a challenge and I will overcome it. And here is what I'm going to take control of to do that, which is the next piece of mental hardiness. So your ability to determine what can and cannot be controlled, and not to waste your energy on what can't be controlled. So this is a conversation we've had countless times in the last couple of years, is let's zero back in on what you can control and really laser focus your energy on that, because anything else is an expenditure of energy that you will never get back. You won't ever get back the time you spent on it or the energy that you spent on things that you can't control. The next piece of mental hardiness is commitment. So having a sense of purpose and engagement in life. I imagine that all of you who chose to be in this training have a strong sense of commitment, and partly probably commitment to your peers and your partners. And so I love that about this course. I'm excited to meet all of you. This is one of the reasons why, and I will enjoy hearing about what that is for you. If you have found or maybe never lost or have refound your sense of commitment to your job, wonderful. I'd love to hear about that too. That's of course an area that a lot of folks are struggling with right now in public safety. And then the next piece is optimism. So this is really just not like some overly sunny fake positivity thing. This is the belief that even if it's not okay now, and maybe it's not, it will be later. That is optimism, and that's realistic optimism. So these are the main pieces of mindset. I think a lot of this, because it's up to you, it can be very difficult to keep up a strong mindset in these areas, especially when others around you may not have a solid mindset and may be suffering from the effects of chronic stress and kind of the layers of stress over the last couple of years. And that absolutely can make keeping your own mindset strong more difficult. However, there are those who soak in the energies around them, and there are those who really command the energy in a room because you are exuding enough of it, and not in a overly annoying way or something, but more in like a you're solid enough with yourself and have such a good boundary and buffer that when you feel that kind of toxic negativity from someone else, And for sure, think to yourself, if you're ever the one giving that off, you can probably listen through it to hear that that person is struggling in some big or small way, and to see it for what it is, that it's likely a pretty significant stress symptom. So we'll talk more about that too. Save up all your questions you might have as we go along here. Here is just a quick couple of stress management strategies. And I'm also sharing with you a stress and recovery management video that I made. It's pretty quick, but it walks you through some breath work. The idea is to build in some recovery time throughout your day. You don't have to be asleep to provide your nervous system some recovery. It's really about trying to dial back, whether you use your breath or you stretch, or you do some quick exercises to burn off some stress chemicals in your body. If you're connecting with friends and family, see if those things can help you. It's best to have less intensity to down-regulate from at the end of the day than more. You'll have less exhaustion in the evening too. You've had some outlets to burn off that stress. If you find yourself craving alcohol, it's often a sign that you're stressed because your system is wanting to sedate itself, which alcohol does. It doesn't actually help your stress levels, of course. So try a stress management strategy first. There's a video coming, like I said, that you'll learn a couple of breath techniques with. I'm sure you already know tactical breathing, but there's another one on there, and a little bit of explanation about why that's so important. Next thing I'd like you to do is make a list. So you can start to think about it if you're not at your notebook or paper or computer right now. But this list is going to be for self-care. So what are the things that refuel your tank? I've made an example list here at the bottom, but the idea is that we make lists all the time for all kinds of things like to-do lists, grocery lists, whatever. But how about making a list of what you do to take care of yourself? I've got one that I put inside the door of a cupboard that I open up when I'm gonna like take my vitamins and supplements in the morning. And also when I do in the evening, it reminds me, what can I do to take care of myself? So start making this list in your mind. You can text yourself again. If you're at your notebook, you can write it down, but take about 5 minutes and just start this list. See if you can get at least 5 things on this list now. And then also I want you to add to it later and have at least 5 more. I can tell you that it really doesn't matter what's on here, because what's on here for you may be the last thing someone else would put on this list. But if you truly feel like you're caring for yourself and kind of refueling when you're doing that thing, then it should be on your list. So for me, a yoga class is self-care. For someone else, it might feel like torture. So it doesn't need to be on your list. This is just an example here. I do want you to consider this because I've run into quite a few clients who didn't come in to see me until they were in crisis. And one of the things that had happened over time was they quit taking care of themselves. They had completely forgotten and lost sight of what to even do to take care of themselves. So their system had become so fried and overdone, and they had kind of ditched everything that they used to do that refilled them and helped clear out stress and all that stuff. And that's commonly what happens. You get more isolated, you get less motivated, and slowly you inch away, sometimes very unnoticeably away from what you really need and love. And so it'll be really important for you now in this role to be extremely on top of these things. So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes here to make sure you have at least 5 things on this list now. And then over the next few days and leading up to us meeting in person, I'd like you to have 10 things on that list. And you may have to think back to what you listed in the past, or what you would have listed in the past, but you've kind of fallen away from. It also doesn't matter if the things that are self-care for you aren't realistic because of time or having young kids or any of that. Just put it on there anyway, because those other things aren't reasons to not have what you really need on your list. So I'll give you just a minute here. All right, so we're gonna leave off here with that list. You've got 2 things done. If you haven't already done them for this section. The first one was to complete that container self-reflection activity, maybe even draw a picture of the container, and I want you to fill in what is in your container. And based on stress symptoms and how much is in that container, how much would you fill that up to? We've just started touching on the resilience factors. Those things, when in place, will often help keep that level of the container down pretty low and to a manageable point. But when those start to fall away, it's sort of a slippery slope or a snowball effect. Once it gets going, it can just feed off of itself in a negative way. Once you feel more stressed, you may do less self-care. When you're doing less self-care, you'll feel even more stressed, and it can snowball that way. So I'd like you to be really aware of it. It's not something you're going to have to share necessarily with somebody else. You may choose to when we're doing our practices and our scenarios. But along with that, though, is the storytelling piece, which we will be doing. We'll be practicing sharing some of what is in your container. I get it's kind of a vulnerable thing, but I'm not asking you to do anything that you won't be assisting others in doing, that you're going to be helping. So just like sometimes therapists go into therapy to help other people with their problems in order to avoid their own, it's not a healthy approach. So I'll just, name that ahead of time and make sure that we're really upfront about having a parallel process for ourselves in what we're going to be providing to the people we'll be helping. So there's the container piece, there's then the storytelling piece, and then this last one here is the self-care. So make a list, at least 5 things now, and then add to it as we near the 2-day in-person training, and make sure that you've got 10 by the end of those 2 days. And then any piece of the self-care that you can start working on now ahead of the 2-day in-person training is a great thing as well. I will be asking you about all of those things, and you'll be utilizing them when we meet in person. So thank you so much for being part of this training generally, for listening, for your attention here, for any thoughtfulness that you're putting into this. I appreciate it. It has ripple effects that you don't even know yet the good that it will bring, but I've seen it, I can imagine it, I know what's ahead, and I appreciate you. So thank you for all that you do, and I will see you in the next video.